sounds like the Supreme Court did not exactly agree with that.
That's flat out wrong by Stephen Miller. Even the 6 conservative justices say anyone is allowed to go into court to challenge this.
If you listen to the mainstream media, it might seem like Trump just had a massive victory in the Supreme Court, with a 5-4 ruling that allows Trump to go forward with his plans to continue to deport people under the Aliens Enemies Act, an act that's never been used under times of peace. Trump and his lackeys are certainly celebrating, as the border Nazi Stephen Miller, aka Droopy the dog, but bald, is already taking victory laps. But it turns out, if you take a look at what even the conservative justices said, this isn't exactly the complete victory the Trump administration is pretending it is. I'll show you guys how Stephen Miller was called out on CNN, as well as take a look at what the Supreme Court actually said. A lawyer for the ACLU called it a big victory. So what exactly is Stephen Miller talking about? If you're enjoying the coverage, make sure to like the video and double check that you're subscribed. For every sub, we'll pluck one hair from the follicles of Stephen Miller's ever-receding hairline. Stephen Miller is the type of person who was never supposed to be taken seriously, but unfortunately, because we live in bizarro world, Stephen was able to worm his way up to having the ear of the president, and at this point, basically writing Trump's immigration and deportation policy for him. That's a huge problem because Stephen Miller happens to be a petulant man-child.
Am I the only one who is sick and tired of being told to pick up my trash when we have plenty of janitors who are paid to do it for us?
And on top of being a piece of shit, he's also an idiot who seems to be vying for the position, along with J.D. Vance, to be Trump's propaganda minister. If you listened to him, you'd think this was a total victory. He says the Alien Enemies Act now in full effect, the foreign terrorists will be arrested and expelled. But according to this ex-prosecutor, Stephen is just straight up wrong.
The Supreme Court ruling tonight permitting immigration officials to deport alleged gang members under the 18th century Alien Enemies Act for now. And there are new limits. The court said that those being deported need to get adequate notification that they're subject to the wartime authority and be allowed to have their removal reviewed. Perspective now from CNN senior legal analyst Aide, former federal prosecutor. So what does that mean? They get to have their case, or the chance to have their case reviewed?
So, Anderson, those are the really important guardrails that the Supreme Court put in tonight. Now, this is a win for the Trump administration because the majority here, the 6 conservative justices, said that the deportation process under the Alien Enemies Act can continue, can resume for now. The liberals wanted to keep it all on pause. But the 2 key guardrails that you hit on, first of all 9 justices agree that any deportee under this act does have a right to go to the courts and to challenge it. And the second part is they have to be given reasonable advance notice so that they actually, as a practical matter, can get to the courts and not be whisked away in the middle of the night like was originally done in this case.
The White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, Stephen Miller, posted on X in reference to someone who had been removed from the U.S. under this act was, quote, ineligible for any form of relief under the law. The only process he was entitled to was deportation. So it sounds like the Supreme Court did not exactly agree with that.
That's flat out wrong by Stephen Miller. Even the 6 conservative justices say anyone is allowed to go into court to challenge this. The difference, though, is that the majority, the conservative justices, said you have to do it through this thing called habeas, which has to be filed in the district where the actual person is being held. The liberals wanted to give broader rights to challenge this in court, more broadly geographically and with respect to how they challenge it. But what Stephen Miller says there is straight up wrong. Everyone agrees you can challenge this in court.
All right, Aide, thanks very much. Also tonight, the Supreme Court has paused a midnight deadline that would have forced the Trump administration to bring back a Maryland man who was deported out of the U.S. to El Salvador on March 15th. And what the government admitted in a court filing last week was what they called an administrative error. Now, today's order came down from Chief Justice Roberts after the Trump administration appealed a lower court's decision that had put the midnight deadline in place. The Supreme Court didn't give any kind of timeline of when they expect to actually rule on the case. That means that the man, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who's a Salvadoran national, is going to remain in that notorious El Salvador prison for now. By the way, the Department of Justice's own attorney who argued this case in a lower court just last week, he admitted in court he had limited information and couldn't answer many of the judge's questions. He seemed frustrated, as did the judge. That did not sit well with Attorney General Pam Bondi. She's now placed that government attorney on administrative leave.
Of course, Pam Bondi is coming after her prosecutors for not being able to articulate these arguments in court when the arguments don't make any sense to begin with. Now, this is definitely a Trump victory, don't get me wrong, because the deportations are being allowed to continue for now. But the for now is definitely important because the court didn't rule that Trump's use of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 was lawful. They ruled that the challenge to him using that act has to come from Texas, where these people are being held, and from those individuals, and not as a class action. The ruling said the court was not resolving the validity of the administration's reliance on the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to carry out the deportations, but found that the challenge to the wartime law must take place in Texas, where the migrants were held, and not in Washington, D.C. The lawyer from the ACLU, Lee Gallant, who is challenging Trump's use of this act, said, "We are disappointed that we will need to start the court process over again in a different venue, but the critical point is that the court rejected the government's remarkable position that it does not even have to give individuals meaningful advance notice to challenge their removal under the Alien Enemies Act. That is a big victory." And that's the other important part here. Not only is it up in the air whether or not Trump can use this act in order to deport people, they just kind of kicked that can down the road, but they also ruled that Trump is not allowed to just deport people without due process.
Just to be very, very clear, notwithstanding a lot of the headlines, the Trump administration did not actually win in the Supreme Court. All the Supreme Court did is say, you need to refile in a different way, a sort of very technical ruling saying file in habeas corpus in different districts where people are detained. But on the substance, the Supreme Court squarely rejected the Trump administration's position. The Trump administration was saying these people do not have a right to due process. We do not have to give them notice before we remove them potentially for the rest of their lives to a foreign prison in El Salvador. We can just put them on a plane. The Supreme Court, all 9 justices said that's wrong. You have to give them notice, and not just notice, but notice and time to get into court to challenge this. So right now, the court has not blessed the government using this wartime authority. It simply said, refile your suits. And that's what we're going to do. And we're going to file multiple suits, and we're hoping to block the removals again.
The court said the administration must give Venezuelans who it claims are gang members reasonable time to go to court. Detainees must receive notice after the date of this order that they are subject to removal under the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. The notice must be afforded within a reasonable time and in such a manner as will allow them to actually seek habeas relief in the proper venue before such removal occurs. This is coming from the conservative majority. This isn't from the dissent. So despite Stephen Miller and the Trump administration saying it's now open season on anybody they claim are gang members, the conservative Supreme Court said, not so fast. You actually have to give these people their day in court, despite the fact that they may be illegal immigrants, and you have to actually prove that they're gang members. The conservatives have been pretending that non-citizens are not afforded due process, which is an absolutely insane argument and a massive slippery slope. The question is still open as to whether or not Trump's use of this act is lawful or not, and it'll probably take some time before that case that's going to be filed in Texas works its way back up to the Supreme Court. But seeing as Trump is going to go through with these deportations in the meantime, it is a big victory that migrants are going to have their day in court before deportation. Maybe then they'll have a chance to explain that their autism awareness tattoo isn't gang related. I'm Tony Hinderman with Really American, and I'll catch you next time.